Chapter 9. The Beeline. Swimming rapidly to the side of the canoe, Pete dived underneath it. Pam had become entangled in the tow rope. Her brother quickly unwound it and gave her a push upward. Pam struggled to the surface of the water, reaching it just before her breath gave out. Pete followed her and helped Pam flop across the overturned canoe. "Are you all right?" he asked anxiously. "Yes. Thank you for saving me, Pete. I don't think I could have held out much longer." With the anxiety for his sister over, Pete looked about for any signs of rescue. He saw none, but in the distance was Henry's motorboat. "It's turning around," he cried out gleefully. "They've seen us." In a few minutes, the men reached them and held out helping hands so the children could climb aboard. "What happened to you two?" Bill asked as he hauled Pam up. "The rope came loose," she answered. "Boy, what a scare you gave us," Bill cried. Pete said he would get the tow line. He threw the rope onto the deck of the Beeline. Bill securely tied the canoe, then he and Pete righted it. "I think you'd better make the rest of the trip with us," Henry said, laughing, and held out a hand to help Pete scramble aboard. "Come on." "Not until I find something that's very important," Pete replied. He dived into the water and headed straight to the bottom. He came up for air 2 or 3 times, but kept on diving. "What's he after?" Bill asked, puzzled. At first, Pam wondered what her brother was up to. She soon guessed the reason, but said nothing until Pete returned to the surface with a grin of satisfaction on his face. In one hand, he had the picnic basket. The others laughed, and the bachelor said, "I see you remembered about my big appetite." Pete handed the basket up to him. Then, with one quick spring from the water, he lifted himself skillfully over the side of the motorboat and sat down to catch his breath. "Nice work," said Henry admiringly. He turned the boat about and went downstream several hundred yards to pick up the floating paddles. Then they set off again toward Shoreham. "You two will catch cold in those wet clothes," Bill said presently to the Hollisters. "I have the answer to that," Henry chuckled, motioning toward the little cabin. "There are some dry clothes in there. Help yourselves." Pam entered the cabin first. She was gone a few minutes, and returned in an outfit which caused roars of laughter. She wore a pair of long dungarees, which were rolled up, a man's white shirt, and a round white sailor hat. "Now you look like a real skipper," Bill told her. "Your turn next, Pete." The boy went to the cabin and returned shortly afterward in a pair of large khaki shorts, pulled in with a belt that went around his waistline twice, and an old mackinaw that hung on him like a tent. Both children stood barefooted, laughing at each other's get-ups. "Well, at least you're dry," Bill said, thanks to Henry's extra supply of clothes. They spread out their wet clothes in the hot sun, and by the time the boat was outside Shoreham, the wind had blown them dry. Pete and Pam switched from their oversized duds, but they had to carry their soggy shoes. Thanking Henry and Bill, they stepped ashore. It was 5:30 when they reached home. As the two walked up the driveway, Holly and Ricky dashed out to meet them. "Did you find Bobby? Why are you carrying your shoes?" "Wait a second and we'll tell you," Pam said, hurrying into the house. Pete and Pam told the story of their day's adventure. Pete was praised for his heroic rescue, and Pam for her clue to Bobby's journey. "Dad will be pleased to hear what you both did," Mrs. Hollister said. Holly stood there beaming. Pam and Pete knew she was bursting to tell them something. "What have you been doing, Holly?" Pam asked her. "I went to see Mrs. Bindle," Holly replied. "She gave me a cookie and said that Bobby's mother's hurrying home. She'll arrive in a few days." "The police must have told her he's missing," Pete spoke up. "No doubt," his mother said. It was already past the usual supper time when Mr. Hollister drove in from work. The children rushed out to greet him, throwing their arms about him. "Pete saved Pam, and Holly got a cookie," Sue shouted. They came home holding their shoes," Ricky chimed in. All of this confused Mr. Hollister. "Wait a second," he said, grinning and holding up his hands. "One thing at a time, please." When the children finished telling their stories, Mr. Hollister said the surprises of the day were not finished yet. "You mean we're going to have more ventures?" Sue exclaimed in excitement. "Not exactly an adventure," their father replied, "but it will be an extra special surprise." "Oh, I love surprises," Sue went on. "I hope it's a lollipop." While his children besieged him for a clue to the surprise, Mr. Hollister glanced at his wristwatch. He smiled and winked at his wife. When Pam saw this, she said, "You know the secret too, don't you, Mother? Please tell us what it is." Before Mrs. Hollister could reply, the doorbell rang. "I guess the surprise is here," she laughed. "May I answer the bell?" Ricky asked. Mrs. Hollister excused him from the table. When the boy reached the door, he let out a whoop. "It's Uncle Russ!" he shouted. Into the dining room, and holding Ricky like a sack of potatoes under one arm, strode a tall, good-looking man. He was their father's younger brother, who lived in Crestwood with his wife Marge and their two children, Teddy and Jean. What a fuss the Hollister children made over him. He grinned broadly as they flocked about. "We heard how you put a frog in the cookie jar when you were a boy," Holly teased him. "You did? And did you hear about the night your father went looking for our pet cat and it turned out to be a skunk?" he asked. The children loved Uncle Russ. Not only was he always full of jokes, but he could draw funny pictures. He was a cartoonist and drew comics for the newspapers. This was the reason the children always wanted to be first to see the paper every morning. Mrs. Hollister invited Uncle Russ to have some supper, but he said he had already eaten. Sue grabbed her uncle by the hand. "Come on, Uncle Russ," she begged. "Let's do our upside-down trick." The tall man reached down, grabbed the little girl, and set her on his shoulders. As Sue giggled in delight, her uncle bent his head forward and somersaulted Sue onto the floor. "Again," she begged. Uncle Russ repeated the stunt, then smoothed out his rumpled hair. "Whew, you must be drinking a lot of milk, because you weigh a ton, Sue." He put his hand into his pocket. "Everybody close his eyes," he ordered. The children did this. Then he said, "Ready!" When they opened their eyes, they saw a handful of lollipops. "Oh," Sue exclaimed, "my lollipop surprise came true." "Your Aunt Marge made these for you," Uncle Russ told them. "They're especially good." "Oh, thank you," everyone said. "Mine is a red camel," said Holly, unwrapping hers. "And I've got a green bear," Pam chimed in. "This one looks like a pink rabbit," said Sue. She had already bitten off a corner, so it was hard to decide what the animal really was. "I wish Aunt Marge would show us how to make these lollipops sometime," Mrs. Hollister spoke up. "Maybe we could even start a business and sell lollipops," Ricky suggested. The children crowded around Uncle Russ and began to ask questions all at once. They wanted to know what their cousins were doing and why their Uncle Russ had come to visit them. Stretching out in an easy chair, the cartoonist said that his family was fine and that he had been on a business vacation. When Pete asked what this meant, his uncle explained, "First I went to buy a new boat. I call it the Sweetie Pie." "A new boat?" Pete exclaimed. "That's super. Is it here?" "Yes, I'll show it to you all tomorrow." "Swell." "After I got the boat," Uncle Russ went on, "I made a long trip alone down the Muscogee River to draw some pictures for my comics." "Please, can we see them?" Pam asked. Sure, they're in my briefcase on the hall table. Will you get it, Pam? She hurried off and brought the bulging briefcase. Uncle Russ opened it and pulled out several sketches. How funny they were. Sue giggled, and Holly laughed. One showed a dog holding a hoop and a clown jumping through it. Another showed an elephant riding on the handlebars of a boy's bicycle. Ricky said they were the luckiest children in the world to see comics even before they appeared in the newspaper. Suddenly, Pam noticed a penciled sketch on a larger piece of cardboard. It was a picture of a boy sitting on the riverbank. "Uncle Russ," she exclaimed as she stared at the drawing. "Who is this?" "I don't know. Some little boy down the river," he answered. "It looks just like Bobby Reed, a boy who's missing from Shoreham," Pam said excitedly. The other children crowded around her. They agreed it surely did look like Bobby. Uncle Russ said the lad had been sitting quietly on the shore many miles below Shoreham. The little fellow had had such a sad expression that he'd felt sorry for him. When he suddenly saw Uncle Russ, who had just finished the sketch, he dashed off into the woods on the riverbank. "I'll bet he was Bobby Reed," exclaimed Pete. Suddenly, Pam said to her uncle, "Will you please take us in your boat to find Bobby Reed?"